ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between. It is DebateSensei NFA-LD edition, where we talk about things relevant to competitive debate in the National Forensics Association Lincoln-Douglas event. I have with me Dr. Justin Kirk from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks again for having me, Jared.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about critiques this episode, and we're going to be applying it to the AI topic as much as possible. But I think this might be a lot of groundwork on critiques as well. We were just talking about how I'm eager to see how much of my training still is relevant to contemporary debate practice.
Yeah, and I think this is a complicated conversation, and so like taking up a whole episode with it, I think is important because there's a lot of like things to know before you even like debate a critique, right?
Right.
And the elements of the debate that it affects. And so I think, especially for folks who are younger or just getting into NFA-LD or haven't done policy debate before, I think this type of argument might be really hard to get your kind of like argumentative hands around at first. But once you figure it out, like I think that critique debating is very much like, and we'll do this throughout the episode, I think a lot like dis-ad counterplan debating.
Yeah.
You gotta kind of think about it that way. But yeah, let's get into it. Let's start talking about like what a critique is, how they function. So the origin stories of the critique go back to like the University of Texas in the 1990s. Folks like Jarris Grove and Stapp and Bill Shanahan kind of invented a way of debating that challenges kind of fundamental assumptions about the affirmative. And so the first critique they wrote was a critique about American imperialism and colonialism, and how those linked up with the topic. But traditionally, critiques have been kind of arguments about assumptions or presumptions that the affirmative has made, and either failed to address or kind of complicated with their policy actions. And as they've grown, different formats have developed to kind of move away from the critique, and kind of like water, critique flows into those debate spaces. So like the critiques are used in high school PF and LD now. They're used in NFA-LD quite a bit, right? And C to NDT, which originally the split happened because critique debating was such a big and prevalent strategic shift in the community. Now you can't go 2 rounds at the NDT without seeing a couple of critiques. And so I think that like, if you think about argumentatively as a coach or as a debater, you're going to run into them, and you're going to run into them at all levels. I've seen them in novice rounds, I've seen them in JV rounds, and I've seen them in open rounds.
I think this, I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but the more I get to know about critiques, the more it seems like it was sort of the original sort of value policy schism that was happening in debate, where critiques were on the value level, and then policy was like advantages versus disadvantages. And so it seems like I don't know, it's way of for me to make sense of it, where it's like what is new was old, you know what I mean, at a time. But I don't know, like, what do you think? Does that make any sense?
No, I think it kind of mirrors some of those questions, right? Like, and we'll talk about in a minute, the different types of critiques kind of line up with different schools of philosophy, right? So it makes sense that they would start like fitting into value criterion debate. The other thing I'd like to note about the history of the critique, right? So the critique was originally a negative argument for a long time,
right?
And then if you go back and watch the old college sports television documentaries from 2003, 2004, they follow a team from Louisville University who started reading critique arguments on the affirmative, right? And a lot of other teams have been messing around with this, but Louisville really kind of took the ball and ran with it and decided they weren't going to read a plan text. Most of the affirmative was going to be performative, and the arguments would then develop throughout the debate as arguments about the 1AC's performance. And so critiques then became not just a negative weapon, but became a very strong affirmative argument to read. And now you even see critique affirmatives in NFA-LD. I mean, there's few and far between, but they're still out there. And so I think that one of the things to know is that critique debating, because debaters are interested in philosophy, is kind of ubiquitous in debate writ large.
I was at Cal State Long Beach at that time, and they were very much in alignment with the Louisville project. They were doing very similar things with reading hip hop affirmatives and evidence from alternative sources rather than journals and peer-reviewed articles and things like that. So
yeah, so let's get into like what kind of critiques there are, because this is kind of a negative episode. So let's talk about like the kind of negative critiques you could read.
Yeah. On the title sequence, I made sure to put negative critiques as a way of
right. I just wanted to clear up that little history part of it, because people are like, "Whoa, there's critiques on the affirmative too." There are, and they're kind of a different thing to deal with. But on the negative, when you're reading a critique, you've got kind of 3 or 4 options that you can choose from. One is kind of a materialist style critique that says the affirmative reproduces kind of material infrastructures and systems that make them worse. You can read an epistemology critique that challenges what the affirmative's knowledge production or where it gets its knowledge from. Right? A lot of these critiques critique like state modes of knowing or scientific modes of knowing. Like nuclearism critiques tend to fall into more the epistemology kind of realm. How do we know what we know about nuclear war? It's all from like wargaming and places like the Rand Corporation, right? So the knowledge that we develop around nuclear weapons is all kind of tied to its kind of existence as a spectacular weapon, right? There's ontology critiques that deal with kind of the beingness of people. So things like the security critique or anti-blackness critiques kind of fall into the ontology critique. Questions of like how we form subjects and how subjects and objects get kind of interplayed in the world. And then there's a whole kind of grab bag of what I would call kind of very idiosyncratic critiques. And they can be either like postmodern authors like a Bataille or a Baudrillard, right? Which has a little bit of epistemology and ontology, but I would say that they're kind of this whole other bag of critiques of like your postmodern author choice. And then there's identity critiques, right? Which I think are another kind of group of arguments that are pretty idiosyncratic to the debater that's reading them, right? That last category, critiques, you're not going to see a generic anti-blackness critique. Oh, did we lose you? Oh, I think we lost Jared for a moment. We're going to pause for a second while we wait for him to come back. All right, great. So yeah, there's the postmodern critiques and the identity critiques kind of blend those together. They can either be ontology critiques or epistemology critiques, and they tend to be idiosyncratic to the debater, right? The debater's identity that's reading them, either queer pes or queer op, anti-blackness, the femk, some versions of set call are kind of identity based, but those tend to be more kind of epistemology, ontology based. So really that last bag of critiques is every one of those that you're going to debate is going to be extremely different from round to round, right? Because those idiosyncratic critiques are going to be very much the whim of the debater who's writing them. And then, with each kind of critique, you're going to have different strategies for approaching them. So we'll try to kind of cover some broad how to answer critique strategies and then kind of go through which ones of these I think fit into those categories on the topic.
Yeah, I think like the structure of critiques is a good place to like kind of get into, like, what are the things that you say or you should anticipate hearing in any critique that you encounter. I think is something that a lot of people, I don't know, especially if you're getting started with critiques, it's kind of like, okay, like I understand like the general principles, but how do I know a critique when I hear it? What's the first thing that people start off by saying?
Usually you'll hear a thesis or a link card. So you'll hear some sort of like thesis about the way the world is and how some sort of structure or ideology or idea that the affirmative doesn't address kind of upsets the affirmative balance, right? And then there's some link to the plan action usually. And those can either be one card. Sometimes critique debaters will find like good link cards that are also the thesis of the argument that they're reading. But sometimes there'll be different pieces of evidence. And you can kind of pick and choose which one of those comes first. The link can come first if you want to talk about the plan, or the thesis card can come first if you're more interested in like making the judge understand what the critique is about. A lot more complex critiques typically need a kind of thesis card to kind of explain what the critique is doing. And then after the link card, you'll hear an impact usually, right? So let's use the capitalism K as an example.
Let's do it.
So you might hear a link that's like, prohibitions on AI prevent focus on taking down like the corporations that run AI. that lets kind of like neoliberal capitalism continue. AI is not a problem. It's a symptom of capitalist accumulation, right? So the plan attacks the symptom, not the cause, right? So the link is usually plan trades action on symptom, which is anti-capitalist organization, for the cause, or trades action on the symptom, which is prohibitions on AI, for the cause, which is like capitalism and anti-capitalist organizing, right? Typically the impact for those critiques are something environmental, right? Most of the capitalism critique authors, people like David Nielsen or the Catherine Kelly Abraham Collective, or folks like Jody Dean, write a lot about how capitalism's biggest impact is resource drains, unequal kind of production versus consumption methods, causing the ecosystem to spiral out of balance, right? Like all of the kind of ecological or environmental or climate impacts you can think of, those authors will say are caused by climate change or caused by capitalism.
Right, and AI has some fairly unique cards that you can collect on that, as far as like the energy needed in order to generate it.
Well, and so that means that there's like affirmative offense against capitalism, right? In the sense of that, like, if you prohibit some types of AI, I know there's a big data centers affirmative, or the AGI affirmative that Western Kentucky's reading, like they have a built-in turn to capitalism by saying, no, we shut down a bunch of data centers, or we prevent their growth, so we don't cause a bunch more energy usage. So capitalism link impact, somewhere there might be a thesis argument about like why capitalism comes before other kind of ways of thinking. And so that's kind of your disad part of the critique, right? That's the link impact part of the critique that says why the AF causes something bad. Then there's usually an alternative, which is typically what we would equate to a counterplan. But the alternative typically doesn't look like a plan or a counterplan, right? And so we can go over a bunch of different alternatives to the capitalism critique, and I can just show you kind of the variety, because link impact is usually pretty standard. It's the question of the alternative and the methods that the negative chooses to solve for those links to the affirmative that is usually really important. So on this topic, a bunch of people started reading Red AI, basically allow artificial intelligence to become kind of proletarian and Bolshevik, right? And have it redistribute wealth. And that's the best way out of capitalism, is a non-biased, non-human system that can redistribute equally based on, principles of communism, from each according to their capabilities and to each according to their needs, right? Like AI would be the best at that, is what these authors argue, right? Jody Dean has a lot of different like kind of creative alternatives, one in which she says the kind of like interpolation of identifying anti-capitalism within each other means if you hail anti-capitalist people as comrades, we can identify each other and build networks out of that. So that's an alternative. We just start calling each other comrades and start thinking as we were comrades in an anti-capitalist movement. There's dual power organizing, which says like policy reform from above, a la Bernie Sanders, and then like kind of from below grassroots anti-capitalist organizing. So you can see just like the variety of methods to address capitalism alone.
You can see the mutual exclusivity too, as well, like using AI for anti-capitalism versus prohibiting it. That there's built-in competition between those two approaches.
And in thinking about like how you want to address the affirmative, a lot of times you're thinking about like what kind of impacts the affirmative is using, what the plan does, right? How the affirmative is framing its impacts, because oftentimes the critique is going to be addressing kind of the way in which the affirmative is presenting evidence and presenting arguments.
So that's my next question. So I think that opens the door to framework, which is a really important part. And whenever we, when I learned critiques, we almost always led with framework. And I'm starting to think that was a little bit more unique to parliamentary debate than some other forms of debate. But like we had like a standard set of arguments about the illusion of fiat, and that the discussion that we're having is like we were trying to prioritize the sort of philosophical or critical discussion that we're having over any sort of net benefits or comparative advantage discussion that the policy might have. Is that still?
It is. And part of it is that the negative the critique authors have gotten really good at what they do, which is that like a lot of the evidence that you're seeing in debate now includes those framework arguments in it, right? As part of the impact, the link, the alternative, you'll have bits of framework arguments throughout, right? Policymaking can't solve capitalism, the state fails, right? So one of the things that negatives will do is in the NR, they'll extract a bunch of those framework arguments out of their evidence and make arguments about why the affirmative doesn't get to weigh its advantages or its AF against the critique, right? And it's presumed that like we read the evidence and the links and the impacts kind of implicate the policy making part of the AF. It's kind of on the AF then to produce a framework argument that allows them to kind of either get rid of the K or produce offense against the K. A lot of times the affirmative will be the first team to bring up a framework argument in the 1AR saying we get to weigh impacts against the K. We have to presume the affirmative passes. We have to presume the alternative is a policy that passes, right? So they can weigh those options in a kind of comprehensive manner. And obviously the negative pushes back against those things and tries to say, well, that's exactly the kind of logic that we're critiquing in the NC, right? And so a lot of times these framework debates kind of get down to one who's doing the better kind of extrapolation out of the evidence they've produced, right? So I think that like the better framework debaters are the ones who can take their critique authors and then talk about why those authors justify their framing position, right? And really framework is just to like, what should we consider first? We've talked about this in other episodes in extinction versus structural violence framing. And this is more of a question, should we consider policymaking first? Or should we consider the knowledge production that goes into policymaking first, right? Like if we've got wackos at the Rand Corporation, like General LeMay producing bombing runs in Vietnam, we sure as heck better start questioning where they're producing that knowledge, right? We know that General LeMay was getting his knowledge from like groupthink and a bunch of people at the Rand Corporation during Vietnam weren't always bombing the right targets, right? So like that produces a kind of epistemological scrutiny that the affirmative has to pass through in order to kind of get to policymaking. So a lot of times there's a sequencing argument. Our considerations come first. Can't make policy without knowing who you are and what kind of knowledge you produce, things like that.
Right. So I mean, I'm starting to see why Parley did it that way, because we're not reading evidence, and so it's like you got to put it front and center, right? Like you can't just hand somebody a card and say, "Hey, take a look at the fourth line there." That's where it is.
Well, and typically the affirmative by reading the plan text has presumed a framework for the debate, which is we've read a policy. And we want the judge to evaluate the like consequences, the good and the bad of that policy, right? And so like by reading a plan text, the affirmative is kind of forwarded a framework, and then the negative is like forwarded a counter framework with the alternative. And then the debate really starts to happen after the NC and cross X and the 1AR and things like that.
Okay, so we got like a basic on the capitalism one, and the red AI is like it really helps snap it into focus, because capitalism, I hear that pretty much every year on every topic, like which is like to be expected. But the unique application is kind of what makes it interesting. What other sort of types of critiques are fairly prevalent on the AI topic?
So I think digital colonialism or settler colonialism is a big one. There's a couple of really good articles out there about, I think they're by Ayers, about how AI uses data from indigenous sources without kind of checking. And there's a lot of like digital colonialism arguments that the benefits of AI will only be given to the settler state, right? A series of arguments that sound a lot like settler colonialism, but have been kind of brought into the AI age with kind of specific arguments about how AI data is trained on indigenous knowledge, is using it, etc., and that indigenous forms of AI might look completely different than what we see. There is a pretty decent security AI critique that we've been reading. And I can't really think about like the level of success it's had, because I don't know that we've gone for it in a ton of debates. But the argument is that the affirmative prohibitions are kind of like a technological fear, like a technophobia critique.
Got it.
And that overreactions to things like AI produce like harmful ontologies. This is kind of a security critique, a la Anthony Burke or Jacques Derrida, but it's more with AI as the target, right? Instead of fear of other countries, it's fear of technologies. cause like harmful social practices. We start lashing out at things. People become Luddites. There's a risk that you build more Ted Kaczynskis who like do violence to try and stop technological advancement, right? Stuff like that. And then, I mean, there's just like a kind of a series of kind of somewhat specific critiques. Like, I mean, the Western Kentucky Empire affirmative is a critique affirmative.
Okay.
It's very specific to AI and the Hart and Negri book Empire. But I would say that if you're looking for like the kind of main flavors of critiques, it's things like capitalism and set call, a little bit of security. Oh, the abolition K has been a big one this year, especially against law enforcement AFs. They claim to solve racism, incarceration, police brutality, either abolish the police or abolish the prisons. And that critique is much more of a methods debate.
Right.
That's like reform bad. The system is broken. We must throw it away and build something new. Right. So the abolition critique is like abolition versus reformism. Right. And you just have to win the like abolition good debate to prove that the affirmative isn't doing enough. Right.
Yeah. And that one has a built-in alternative. But like, what are some of the alternatives for like settler colonialism and for the security?
So typically that you'll see things like some sort of kind of indigenous epistemological approach to AI. Right, because AI is a technological kind of symptom. It's a scientific project. A lot of the critiques say that indigenous epistemologies are key to counteracting the colonialism of science, right? And so adopting kind of epistemologies from indigenous perspectives about how we adopt, utilize, implement technology means that, we probably do ban this AI, but it's probably not the first thing we do, right? We probably like dismantle some of the bigger AI corporations first, take them out of the hands of the state, right? Like that alternative looks very different than the plan does, even though it might end up happening. I
came across an interesting story about AI, and this was a couple of years ago when AI was just really first starting to kind of make the news, where it was something that analyzed images online, and then like be shown an image of old schoolhouses with Native American children in it, and it would show like happy children would be the description or something like that, where that is very much not the description that would have been used by anybody from the Native American community. And so one of the results of this was a group of people getting together in order to kind of feed information into AI systems in order to kind of right that wrong, in order to give that perspective. It seems a little kind of similar on the same line, you know what I mean, of what you're talking about.
Well, and I think that is a large problem with technology writ large, right? It's designed by the perspectives that build them, right? And if AI is built from a white Western perspective, it's collecting white Western data, right? And it's doing so probably through a very kind of set of rose-tinted glasses, right? And I think that like when you think about data colonialism more broadly, it's not just that, right? There's generations of blood data that we've collected from indigenous peoples because the blood quantum rule. They are one of the most monitored, tracked, and measured populations in the United States. That is a pretty big surveillance kind of concern for people, right? So I think that like the idea that the plan tries to resolve AI's harms without addressing indigenous concerns is a appropriate question to ask in these kind of on this topic. So yeah.
All right. I do have a question that's always been bugging me about critiques. It is about uniqueness. Because the shorthand description was always that critiques are kind of like non-unique disadvantages. But I've come across, and I'm failing to remember exactly it, but I've come across some issues. I'm like, that seems like uniqueness is still an issue with critiques, that there is some sort of uniqueness factor that could cause you trouble if you don't address it. I don't know. What are your thoughts about uniqueness and critiques?
Let's talk about this in like concept of the capitalism K, right? Because I think this is a great example. Capitalism is everywhere. It's ubiquitous, except for like North Korea, Cuba. I mean, like even China is like one of the most capitalist countries on the planet, right? And so the question is, does the plan like accelerate capitalism in a way that is detrimental? The answer is probably no, right? Like that's the answer to your uniqueness question. Is capitalism so huge, the plan's a drop in the bucket. So this produces some problems for the critique debater, right? So it can create a double bind on the alternative. The alternative is like, let's get rid of capitalism. Let's organize against it. We should solve for capitalism, right? And the negative, in order to win, you have to presume they solve for some of that. Well, if you're the negative debater and your alternative is so hot that it solves all of capitalism, it probably also solves the capitalism the affirmative causes, right?
Okay.
And so, like, in order to overcome the uniqueness problems on the critique, the alternatives have to be really powerful, right? To address system-wide, identity-wide, philosophy-wide problems, right? And so the alternative in trying to address those problems has to have, like, you know, a superstar batting average of like, we solve capitalism every time. But then it begs the question of like, well, if it's that good, why does the plan even matter in the larger scheme of things? Can't we do the plan and the alternative overcomes whatever capitalism the plan causes, right? The other question for that is, so there's a trick on the capitalism dissat. Let's say anti-capitalist movements are coalescing now, and the anti-capitalist revolution is on the brink, right? Bernie's been rallying a lot lately. He's been selling out in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Omaha, Nebraska, right? Like there's good arguments to be made that like Trump's overreach, certainly with Elon Musk and the kind of move to oligarchy of the Trump administration, has caused an anti-capitalist backlash, right? Boycotts, you know, solidarity movements, pro-science rallies, things like that. And you could make the argument that the plan delays the coming revolution, right? And that's one way to produce uniqueness for a critique. It's very rare, and I think it really only works with the capitalism critique. You have to have some sort of like movements coming now to solve the impact, but the plan delays those movements or crushes them or something like that.
So I want to tie this into another phrase that I hear a lot, and that is the role of the ballot. Because sometimes that's where I would be talking about the uniqueness. I'm like, why is this round of debate unique? You know what I mean? Like, what do we uniquely produce, or overlook, or things like that? What does this conversation uniquely produce in terms of the role of the ballot? What do you consider to be like a good explanation for how the role of the ballot plays into critique debates?
So I'm going to give you my snarky answer first. We'll my snarky answer is the role of the ballot is to report to tab who won and lost the debate in the speaker points. That's it. That's like the ballot has no significance beyond reporting mechanism. But that's my snarky answer. The real answer is I think role of the ballot is a reductive way to think about what the critique debaters are trying to do.
Okay.
Right. I think very few critique debaters today are like, I'm going to change the world in the round. Right. Like, I think very few of them are arguing for things like spillover into the real world. Some of them do, or like changing the debate community. A lot of them are kind of pessimistic on the, like, if people pick up on this, it'll make debate better. Right. Even though I think it probably has in a lot of ways. Debaters are smarter. They can handle more arguments. Right. But I think in questions of the role of the ballot in a debate round, it's asking a value of like, what has the negative done that we can equate to the value of having research constructed and presented the affirmative, right? Because there's a presumption in debate that the affirmative wins because they did the research. They came up with a policy that proves the resolution true, and then read that and successfully defended it in a debate. So it begs the question, if you're not disproving the affirmative, which is typically the negative's burden, what is the role of the negative in that round? And so I think it's more fair to think of it as like, what's the role of the negative? If it's not rejoinder, right? Because typically in a debate, the negative's burden is rejoinder. But the critique typically will say, no, our burden should be also one of proof, and we're proving something different.
Okay.
Right? And I think so it's not as much role of the ballot, but it's still a framing argument about how the judge should evaluate who's done the better debating in the round. And I think it's a little reductive to be like role of the ballot, role of the judge, right? Like that just gives people kind of something to hang their hat on. When in reality, it's a question of like, what is the negative's burden now that they've kind of foregone the burden of rejoinder? And they're no longer trying to disprove the affirmative, but trying to prove something separate.
Okay.
Do we hold them to a higher standard? A lot of judges do, right? And critiques are pretty hard to win against traditional judges in debate because, you know, they see a lot of the same problems you do with uniqueness and what happens outside of this round and questions like that.
Okay. Well, I think this has covered some of the fundamentals of critiques, as well as giving a few pretty good examples to use on this AI topic. So I want to thank you, Justin. Giving this some feedback. And these are some of the things I've been wanting to bounce off of other debate coaches for a little while. So I'm glad you're able to do so.
Well, and, you know, I think that this is one of those arguments that will always be developing.
Right.
Because it is kind of in line with philosophical developments.
Right.
And I think that as long as policymaking is kind of the mode that we expect affirmatives to do, there will always be reasons to critique policymaking and the affirmatives approach to it. So, you know, if you're somebody who's looking to run a critique this year, check out some wikis, read up on the CapK. I think that's a good one to get started with. It's pretty straightforward and easy and generic to every topic. And once you learn it, you never have to forget it because you can debate it every year.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. I look forward to coming back in the future, talking about some more strategic stuff about this topic.
Absolutely. Have a good one, Jared.
See ya.